The dust of the Nevada desert settled on everything, a fine, tan powder that coated the immaculate hangars and the gleaming fuselages of the world's most advanced aircraft. It settled, too, on the shoulders of the woman who walked from the transport bus to the main administration building of Creech Air Force Base. She carried a single, unassuming black duffel bag and wore a plain, olive-drab flight suit devoid of rank, patches, or insignia. Her name, according to the travel orders clutched in her hand, was Vance. The guards at the gate had glanced at her papers with practiced indifference, their eyes sweeping over her before returning to the shimmering heat haze on the horizon. They saw a civilian contractor, another cog in the vast, grinding machinery of national defense. They saw nothing. Inside, the air conditioning was a sudden, sterile shock. A young airman first class, barely out of his teens, took her papers without looking up from his computer screen. Vance Alara, technical advisor, he mumbled, his fingers clattering on the keyboard. You're assigned to the 432nd Wing. Data analysis. Your workstation is in Hangar 4, Sublevel B. Here's your temporary access badge. Don't lose it. He slid the plastic card across the counter, his gaze already moving on to the next task. He didn't notice the way she moved, an economy of motion that suggested a body honed by discipline far more rigorous than basic training. He didn't see the faint, silvery line of a scar that traced the edge of her left temple, almost hidden by a stray lock of dark hair. He saw a name and a designation, and filed her away in his mind as irrelevant. She walked toward Hangar 4, the cathedral-like structures looming over her. The air thrummed with a constant, low-frequency hum, the sound of power, of readiness. Inside, the roar was deafening. Ground crews swarmed over the sleek, gray forms of F-22 Raptors, their voices sharp and urgent over the shriek of pneumatic tools. Pilots, clad in G-suits and radiating an aura of supreme confidence, strode past her, their laughter and banter carving out a space of privilege in the chaos. They were modern-day knights, and this was their court. Her presence was a nullity, a ghost drifting through their world. She found the stairs to Sublevel B, a metallic cage that descended into the cooler, quieter guts of the base. Her workstation was exactly as she'd expected, a sterile cubicle with 3 monitors, a high-end processing unit, and a view of a concrete wall. It was a place for watching, for processing the aftermath of action, a place far removed from the sky. She set her duffel bag down, the sound swallowed by the hum of the servers. She sat, powered on the system, and began to work. Her world shrank to the glowing data streams on the screens, a river of numbers and telemetry that told the true story of what was happening in the air above. Colonel Marcus Thorne, commander of the wing, did not like anomalies. And Vance was an anomaly. He stood in the doorway of the sublevel data hub, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence radiating an authority that made junior officers flinch. He held a thin file in his hand. "Vance," he said, his voice cutting through the low hum. Alara didn't startle. She finished typing a line of code, her fingers moving with unhurried precision, then turned her chair to face him. Her eyes, a calm, steady gray, met his. "Colonel," she acknowledged, her tone even. Thorne stepped into the cramped space, the scent of his starched uniform and faint cologne an invasion. "I've reviewed your file," he began, tapping the folder against his palm. "It's thin, exceptionally thin. Civilian technical advisor, Pentagon appointment. No operational history listed. No service record. No references to speak of." He paused, letting the silence hang, expecting a defense, an explanation. He received none. Alara simply waited. His jaw tightened. "Let me be clear, Ms. Vance. This is the tip of the spear. We operate the most sophisticated aerial combat platforms ever designed. The men I command are the best of the best. They're graduates of the most demanding programs in the world. They do not need a civilian analyst with a ghost resume telling them how to fly their machines." His words were a finely crafted dismissal, designed to put her in her place, to establish the hierarchy she had so rudely bypassed with her mysterious appointment. Around them, A few data techs and junior officers pretended to be absorbed in their work, but their ears were tuned to the confrontation. They had all wondered about the quiet woman who had appeared overnight. The colonel was now voicing their collective skepticism. He saw her silence not as poise, but as a lack of substance. He saw a bureaucratic error, a box ticker sent from Washington who would contribute nothing but paperwork. "Your station is down here for a reason," he continued, his voice dropping to a more condescending, almost paternal tone. "Analyze the data. Write your reports. Stay out of the way of the professionals. Am I understood?" Alara's expression remained unchanged. There was no flicker of anger, no hint of intimidation. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood, Colonel," satisfied. Thorne turned on his heel and strode out, the air settling in his wake. The message was clear. She was an outsider, tolerated but not accepted. A ghost in the machine. As he left, one of the young lieutenants, a pilot named Caden Viper Jensen, smirked in her direction before turning back to his peers, resuming his story about a high G turn. They did not see her turn back to her screens, her focus absolute. They did not understand that she had already dismissed them far more completely than they had ever dismissed her. Alara didn't waste energy on resentment. The colonel's institutional arrogance, the pilot's youthful pride, it was all just data, predictable variables in a complex system. She returned to her work, her world contracting once more to the glowing screens. From her subterranean perch, she had a perfect, unvarnished view of the base's operations. The monitors displayed raw telemetry from every training sortie, every simulator session. She saw everything the pilots did, stripped of ego and bravado. She saw the minute hesitation before a weapon's release, the fractional overcorrection in a defensive maneuver, the subtle spike in a pilot's heart rate that signaled a loss of situational awareness fractions of a second before they themselves knew it. She absorbed it all, her mind processing the patterns, filing them away. Her days fell into a quiet rhythm. She arrived before dawn, left long after the sun had dipped below the desert mesas. She spoke little, ate alone in the corner of the mess hall, and returned to her small, sterile room in the bachelor officer quarters. One afternoon, she rolled up the sleeves of her flight suit to fix a loose connection on her terminal. For a moment, the skin of her inner forearm was exposed. A young maintenance tech, a quiet sergeant named Diaz who was replacing a server fan nearby, glanced over. He saw the tattoo. It was not the usual crude ink of a soldier. It was a fine-lined, stylized raptor, an osprey perhaps, its wings half-folded as if in a terminal velocity dive. It was rendered in shades of gray and black, so subtle it was almost a trick of the light. Diaz looked away quickly, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. It was a mark of belonging, but to what he couldn't guess. It didn't match any known squadron or unit insignia. Later, on her way back to her quarters, Alara would take the long route, a path that led past a fenced-off corner of the base, known as the Boneyard there. Among dust-covered hulks of retired aircraft sat a lone F-15C Eagle. Its paint was faded, its canopy clouded, but its lines were still aggressive, still proud. She would pause by the fence, her gaze tracing the contours of the jet. A flicker of something, memory, loss, connection, would cross her face before being suppressed. It was a silent communion with a ghost of her own. The pilots rarely saw her, but their data was her constant companion. She noticed a persistent, almost negligible variance in the hydraulic pressure readings of Raptor 0 to 4, Caden Jensen's assigned aircraft. It was within acceptable parameters, a ghost in the data that the automated diagnostics ignored. The next morning, she found Sergeant Diaz conducting pre-flight checks on the jet. "Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet enough not to carry. "Check the tertiary hydraulic actuator on the port stabilator. Run a microfracture scan." Diaz looked up, surprised she even knew the terminology. "Mung?" It cleared all diagnostics. The data shows a resonance shadow under load. "It's small, but it's there." He hesitated, caught between protocol and the strange certainty in her voice. A lieutenant would have laughed her off. A colonel would have dressed her down, for stepping out of her lane. But Diaz was a man who trusted machinery, and he heard an echo of that same trust in her tone. He shrugged. "Won't hurt to look," he ran the deep scan. 30 minutes later, he stared at the readout, his eyes wide. A hairline fracture, invisible to the naked eye, so small it only affected pressure under the specific G-forces of Jensen's preferred maneuvers. If it had failed in a high-speed turn, the stabilator would have locked, sending the $70 million aircraft into an unrecoverable flat spin. Diaz found her back in her sublevel office. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, a silent offering of respect. Alara nodded back, her eyes already back on the river of numbers flowing across her screens. The ghost in the machine had been found by the ghost in the base. The pressure began as a low hum of anxiety in the command center and escalated into a palpable wave of panic. The exercise was codenamed Cerberus, a test of their top pilots against a new, revolutionary AI-driven air defense network. The system wasn't just smart, it was adaptive. It learned from every engagement, evolved its tactics in real time. For 2 days, the best pilots at Creech had been flying simulator sorties against it, and for 2 days, they had been systematically, humiliatingly annihilated. The main holographic display in the command center showed a tactical map littered with red icons, the digital ghosts of F-22s shot down by the AI. Colonel Thorne stood before the display, his face a mask of granite, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Again, Viper," he commanded, his voice tight. "Engage again. Find a seam." In his simulator pod, Lieutenant Caden Viper Jensen was sweating through his flight suit. He gritted his teeth, yanking the Raptor through a gut-wrenching turn. "No joy, Command. It's anticipating everything. It's like it knows what I'm going to do before I do." On his display, a dozen simulated surface-to-air missiles were arcing toward him. He deployed countermeasures, jinked hard left, but it was useless. A shrill tone filled his headset, and his screen flashed red. Weapons impact. "Egress. Egress. Egress." He slammed his gloved fist against the canopy of the simulator. "Damn it. It's impossible. The parameters are rigged," he yelled into the comms. In the command center, the other pilots muttered in agreement. They were warriors, aces, and they were being beaten by a ghost, a string of code. Their pride, the very foundation of their identity, was cracking. "It's the system," another pilot insisted. "It doesn't play by the rules." Thorne's face was grim. This wasn't just a failed exercise. It was a report he would have to send to the Pentagon, an admission that his vaunted pilots couldn't overcome a machine. The atmosphere was thick with the metallic taste of failure. Down in her concrete haven, Alara watched it all unfold. She wasn't looking at the flashy tactical display. Her screens were filled with the raw data feeds, the logic loops of the Cerberus AI, the infinitesimal hesitations in the pilot's control inputs. They were trying to outfly the system, to beat it with speed and aggression. They saw it as an enemy to be overpowered. Alara saw it differently. She saw its logic, its programming. It wasn't a monster, it was a puzzle. It didn't anticipate their moves through magic, but through predictive algorithms based on their training, their doctrine, their very human impulses. They were fighting it on its terms, and on its terms, it was invincible. She watched Viper fail for the 4th time. She watched Thorne's shoulders slump in defeat. She heard him give the order. "Scrub the exercise. Pull everyone out. We're done for the day." A collective sigh of frustrated relief went through the room. The tension began to ebb, replaced by a sullen, defeated silence. It was in that moment of quiet surrender that a single, calm voice cut through the air from the comms link to the data analysis section. "Colonel," it was Alara. "There's a flaw in their approach." A collective stillness fell over the command center. Heads turned toward the speaker on the wall that carried her voice. Colonel Thorne's back stiffened. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing on the camera that linked to her station. "Explain yourself, Vance," he said, his voice dangerously low. He was in no mood for cryptic comments from a civilian analyst. "They're fighting the system's logic." Alara's voice came through, steady and devoid of emotion. "They're trying to be unpredictable, but their version of unpredictability is still within the AI's predictive models. It knows their doctrine better than they do. You can't outfight it, Thorn's lip curled into a sneer. Is that so? And I suppose you have a brilliant solution, sitting down there with your numbers? The challenge was thick with sarcasm, a public slapdown. The silence that followed stretched for a long, heavy moment. Then, the door to the command center hissed open. Vance stood there. She had walked up from the sublevel, a ghost materializing in their midst. She met Thorn's glare without flinching. "Don't fight it," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Use it against itself. Bait its predictive models into a recursive loop. Make it dedicate so much processing power to anticipating your next move that it can't effectively target your current 1 inch." The pilots stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. Kate and Jensen let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A recursive loop? What is this, a computer science lecture? We're flying fighters, not hacking a mainframe." Ignoring him, Elara walked past the stun group, her steps silent and purposeful, directly toward the empty simulator pod, the one just vacated by the Wing's second-best pilot. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for an order. She simply swung herself up into the seat, her movements fluid and practiced. She began strapping herself in, her fingers moving with a swift efficiency that spoke of thousands of hours of repetition. A simulator tech rushed over. "Ma'am, you're not authorized." Thorn held up a hand, stopping him. He was furious at her audacity, but a deeper, more desperate curiosity had taken hold. "Let her," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let the consultant show us how it's done." He gestured to the main display. "Patch her in. Full telemetry. I want to see everything." Elara pulled the helmet on, the visor obscuring her face. The cockpit canopy lowered with a hiss, sealing her inside. Her voice, now filtered through the comms, was calm and direct. "I'm in." On the main screen, a new green icon, call sign observer, appeared at the edge of the Cerberus engagement zone. For a moment, it sat perfectly still. Then it moved. It didn't scream forward. It didn't jink or weave. It drifted, a lazy, almost indolent flight path that seemed to invite destruction. The AI responded instantly. A dozen threat indicators blossomed on the map, vectors locking onto her. But she didn't react. She continued her slow, deliberate dance, making a series of tiny, seemingly random adjustments to her speed and altitude. The AI, programmed to counter high-speed, high-G threats, seemed confused. It kept recalculating, reprioritizing, its threat cones flickering uncertainly. She wasn't giving it a problem to solve. She was giving it an unsolvable one. Then she attacked. She didn't fire missiles from a distance. She dove, using the AI's own predictive blind spots to get inside its kill zone. Her maneuvers so precise, so economical, they looked less like flying and more like surgery. One by one, the red enemy icons vanished from the screen, each destroyed by a perfect shot. She moved through the web of threats like a phantom, a ghost in the machine that was supposed to be unbeatable. The entire command center had gone utterly silent. They watched, mesmerized as the last enemy sight was neutralized. The screen flashed a message no one had seen before. Objective complete. Perfect score. The canopy on the simulator hissed open. Elara unstrapped herself and climbed out. She pulled off the helmet, her expression as placid as ever. The room was still, the silence thick with shock and disbelief. She looked at Thorn, her gray eyes holding his. "The data," she said simply, showed the path. The aftermath was a vacuum of stunned silence. The pilots, men who defined themselves by their skill in the air, stared at the telemetry replay on the main screen. They watched the green icon of Observer weave a perfect, impossible thread through a tapestry of death. It was a performance so flawless it bordered on the sublime, and it shattered their understanding of what was possible. Their earlier smirks and condescension had evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked bewilderment. Colonel Thorne stood frozen, his eyes locked on the data stream, replaying the final moments of her run over and over. The flight path made no sense according to standard combat doctrine, yet its success was absolute, undeniable. He felt the foundations of his rigid, hierarchical world begin to tremble. Caden Viper Jensen, his face pale, approached Alara as she stood by the simulator, his youthful arrogance completely stripped away. "How?" he started, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you do that? The maneuvers you used, they're not in any playbook. Some of them should have torn the wings off." Alara met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not an empty civilian but a depth he couldn't fathom. "The playbook is for fighting pilots," she said, her voice low. "I was fighting a machine. You have to speak its language." She turned to leave, her part in the drama seemingly over. As she walked toward the door, she brushed past an older Chief Warrant officer, a man named Sal Connie, who had been maintaining flight systems since the days of the F-4 Phantom. He was a repository of institutional memory, a man who saw more than he spoke. His eyes, sharp and knowing, caught sight of her forearm as her sleeve shifted. He saw the tattoo of the diving osprey. His breath hitched, an almost inaudible gasp. A memory sparked in the back of his mind, a whisper from years ago, a rumor about a black project, a program that was officially erased from existence. He muttered a single word under his breath, so quiet only he could hear it. "Wraith," he said nothing more, his face becoming an impassive mask, but he watched her walk away with a look of profound, almost fearful, respect. The perception in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted. The ghost they had ignored was now a presence that dominated the space, her silence more potent than all their boasts combined. She hadn't explained herself. She had simply demonstrated a truth they were now forced to confront. They were pilots, but she was something else entirely. The next day brought a new crisis, one born of metal and wire, not code. The lead F-22 for an upcoming international air demonstration, a high-stakes showcase for foreign dignitaries, was grounded. It was plagued by a phantom electrical fault, a ghost in its complex nervous system. For 12 hours, the manufacturer's top field technicians and the base's own elite maintenance crew had swarmed the aircraft, running every diagnostic in their arsenal. They found nothing. The avionics would flicker, the fire control system would reboot at random, yet every test came back green. The Raptor, a pinnacle of aerospace engineering, was defeated by a gremlin no one could find. Colonel Thorne, his mind still reeling from the simulator incident, found himself in an unfamiliar state, out of options. His pride was a small thing compared to the impending international embarrassment of a grounded showcase aircraft. He found Alara not in her sub-level office, but in the hangar, standing a respectful distance from the crippled F-22, watching the frustrated techs. She was observing, as always. "Vance," Thorne said, his tone stripped of its former arrogance. It was flat, direct. "They can't find it." It was not a request, but an admission, a concession of defeat. Alara turned to him. She looked past him, her eyes on the aircraft. It was more than a machine to her. She saw it as a living thing, its systems a complex anatomy. She walked toward the Raptor, and the maintenance crew, a mix of military and civilian personnel, parted for her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had heard the stories from the simulator room, whispers of an impossible perfect score. She didn't look at their diagnostic laptops or their sensor readings. She motioned for a ladder, and with the same fluid grace she'd shown entering the simulator, she climbed into the cockpit. She didn't strap in. She simply sat, placing her hands lightly on the sidestick controller and the throttle, closing her eyes. The techs exchanged confused glances. What was she doing? Meditating. She sat in the silence of the powered-down cockpit for a full minute, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then she spoke to the crew chief. "Power up the auxiliary systems." Just the auxiliaries. The lights in the cockpit flickered to life, bathing her in a soft green glow. She didn't look at the displays. Instead, she slid her hand from the controls and placed it flat against a specific panel on the right side of the console, the one housing the environmental control and secondary power relays. She held it there, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was feeling the machine, feeling the subtle flow of electrons, the almost imperceptible vibrations that hummed through its frame. "It's not software," she said finally, her voice clear in the cavernous hangar. "It's a harmonic resonance. The frequency from a secondary power coupling is off by less than 1,000th of a hertz. It's creating a feedback loop, generating false data packets. They're confusing the main bus. It's like tinnitus for the aircraft." She pointed to a small, insignificant-looking component buried deep within the panel. "Replace that power modulator. The one with the serial number ending in 7B, the lead technician from the manufacturer scoffed. "Ma'am, that component has nothing to do with the avionics bus. It's an isolated system. We've checked it." Alara didn't argue. She just looked at him with her steady, unnerving calm. Colonel Thorne, watching from the hangar floor, made the decision. "Do it," he commanded. Grumbling, the tech opened the panel and, after 20 minutes of painstaking work, replaced the tiny part. They sealed the panel and, with a collective sense of anticipation, powered up the full system. The cockpit came alive. The displays were clear and steady. They ran the avionics through a dozen cycles. The flicker was gone. The random reboots had vanished. The ghost was exorcised. A stunned silence fell over the maintenance crew, their skepticism replaced by a profound, humbling awe. She hadn't used their tools. She had simply listened to the machine and understood its pain. Respect was no longer a question. It was a given. Colonel Thorne felt as if the ground beneath him had become unstable. The woman known as Alara Vance had, in 2 days, effortlessly dismantled 2 problems that had stumped his best and brightest. This was not the work of a technical advisor. This was the work of a master. That evening, in the secure, soundproof confines of his office, he did something highly irregular. He used his command-level clearance and a favor owed to him by a 3-star general at the Pentagon to bypass the civilian contractor block on her file. He wanted to know who she was. The response came an hour later, not as a digital file, but as a single, encrypted message instructing him to access a specific terminal in the base's secure intelligence vault. The file he opened was sealed under a classification so high he had never seen it before. Project Chimera. The words on the screen painted a picture of a program that existed in the deepest shadows of military research and development. Chimera was not about building a better aircraft. It was about fundamentally redefining the relationship between pilot and machine. It involved experimental neural interfaces, biofeedback systems, and flight controls that translated thought directly into action. It was a program designed to create a true symbiosis, to merge human intuition with machine capability. The program had been wildly successful and catastrophically dangerous. The pilots, a handful of individuals selected for their unique neurological and psychological profiles, had achieved performance levels that were considered physically impossible. They didn't just fly their custom-built test aircraft. The file said they wore them. But the mental and physiological strain was immense. The project was abruptly terminated and buried after the incident. The file was heavily redacted, but it spoke of a final test flight where the lead pilot pushed the interface past every known boundary, taking the aircraft into a performance envelope from which it was never designed to return. The pilot survived. The program did not. The pilot's name was redacted, listed only by her call sign. Wraith. The file noted she was grounded permanently, her identity scrubbed, and reassigned to a non-operational civilian role to be observed. The silvery scar on her temple, Thorne now realized, was not from an accident. It was the mark of where the interface had been connected. His hands felt cold. He shut down the terminal, the silence of the vault pressing in on him. He walked back to his office, his mind racing. He sent a single, encrypted message to Chief Warrant Officer Connie. The Osprey tattoo. "What do you know?" The reply came back minutes later, just 3 words. Project Chimera. Wraith. Connie knew. The old soldier had recognized the symbol of the Black Project. The quiet woman in Sublevel B was not a consultant. She was a legend, thought to be a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered among the old guard. She was the pilot who had flown too high, too fast, who had touched something no one else could, and had been exiled for it. Thorne looked out his window at the darkened flight line, at the rows of sleeping raptors. He had dismissed her, condescended to her. He had ordered a master to stay out of the way, and he finally understood the sheer, humbling magnitude of his mistake. The Day of the Air demonstration dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast, empty canvas of blue. Foreign military attaches and dignitaries milled about the VIP viewing area, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the dusty functionality of the base. The centerpiece of the day, the F-22 Raptor solo demonstration, was scheduled for noon. The pilot assigned was the wing's top ace, a major with thousands of hours and a chest full of medals. But 10 minutes before takeoff, a frantic call came into the command tower. The major had been struck by a sudden, violent case of food poisoning. He was grounded, unequivocally. A wave of controlled panic rippled through the command staff. Canceling was not an option. Sending up a less experienced pilot to perform a watered-down routine would be an embarrassment. Colonel Thorne stood on the tarmac, the desert sun beating down on him, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. His gaze drifted across the hangar and settled on a lone figure standing in the shadows, watching the activity with her usual quiet intensity. Alara. Thorne didn't hesitate. He walked directly toward her, his stride purposeful. The ground crew and pilots nearby fell silent, watching the interaction. He stopped in front of her, the two of them a small island of stillness in the pre-flight chaos. He didn't speak of the grounded pilot or the waiting dignitaries. He didn't ask her if she could fly the Raptor. He knew the answer. He looked at the woman the file called Wraith, the master who had been hidden in his own base, and he offered the only thing that mattered. A flight technician jogged up, holding the lead pilot's helmet. Thorne took it from him. He held it out to Alara. It was not an order. It was an offering, a question, a plea. Alara looked from the helmet to Thorne's eyes, and in them she saw the complete reversal of his previous arrogance, replaced by a desperate, earnest respect. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. She took the helmet. A silent, electric current passed through the personnel on the flight line. They had all heard the stories now, the simulator, the harmonic resonance. As Alara walked toward the gleaming F-22, the ground crew, who days before would have ignored her, snapped to attention, their movements sharp and reverent. The young pilots, including Caden Jensen, watched from the sidelines, their faces a complex mixture of awe, shame, and vicarious excitement. This was history, and they knew it. Alara climbed into the cockpit, her movements economical and certain. The canopy lowered, sealing her away. The engines spooled up, not with their usual roar, but with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone watching. She taxied to the runway. The tower cleared her for immediate takeoff, but she didn't perform the standard, thunderous departure that rattled windows for miles. The F-22 rolled forward, lifted off gently, and then went vertical. A pure, silent, impossible climb, straight up into the deep blue until it was just a speck. Then, high above the base, she began to fly. It wasn't an airshow routine. It was a conversation with the sky. She performed maneuvers that had no names, that existed outside the known flight envelope. She made the 30-ton fighter dance, executing a series of effortless, impossible loopings. She initiated a controlled, flat spin, holding it for a breathtaking moment before recovering with a flick of the controls, a feat that should have been mechanically impossible. It was not a display of brute force. It was artistry. She was showing them what the machine, what a human in perfect sync with that machine, was truly capable of. When she landed, the tires kissing the tarmac as gently as a whisper, she taxied back to the VIP area. She powered down the engines, and the canopy opened. Colonel Thorne was waiting on the tarmac, standing alone. As she climbed down the ladder, he did not speak. He did not offer a handshake. He simply came to attention and rendered a slow, perfect salute. It was not a salute to a civilian contractor. It was a salute to a master of his craft, a legend he now knew was real. Alara met his gaze, her face unreadable in the harsh sunlight. She gave a single, small, acknowledging nod and walked away. She did not wait for the debrief. She did not linger for the stunned applause from the dignitaries or the reverent gazes of the pilots. She walked back to the quiet of her room, packed her single black duffel bag, and left as unobtrusively as she had arrived. Her purpose there was complete. She hadn't come for accolades or recognition. Perhaps she had come to remind a system grown rigid with pride what it felt like to be humbled by true mastery. Or perhaps she had simply come to remind herself that, despite the grounding, despite the exile, she could still fly. As she walked toward the base gate, the setting sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. It caught the faint, silvery outline of the diving osprey on her forearm, a secret sigil for a forgotten order. Behind her, the F-22 she had flown sat cooling on the flight line, its engine ticking softly in the desert air, the sound of a great beast settling into a well-earned rest. A quiet respect now permeated the base, a change in the atmosphere as tangible as the shift in the evening temperature. The legend of the ghost pilot who did loopings over the base would be told in hushed, reverent tones for years to come. Her strength was not in what she said, but in the silent, echoing truth of what she had done. Her departure left a vacuum filled not with emptiness, but with the dignified, earned closure of silent strength finally, irrevocably honored.